Before we begin, comment below where in the world you're watching from. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more long-form mystery stories. This is not just a legend. It is the sound of the world remembering itself. The world had not truly forgotten what came before the age of kings, before the whisper of written language, before blood had names and stars had gods. It had only swallowed it, folded it deep into the memory of soil and stone and oceanic pressure, as though time itself had agreed to suppress a truth too vast, too ancient, too destabilizing for the narrow framework of modern mind to contain, and so the earth, ever loyal to its long-forgotten masters, kept the memory hidden, not destroyed, not erased, simply buried beneath architecture built by creatures who thought themselves sovereign over forces they could not even name. In that older world, not yet shaped by time as we know it, a fracture had occurred, not a crack in land or sky, but in the deeper weave that connected matter and meaning, energy and will, and through that fracture came not demons nor angels, not celestial kings nor infernal tyrants, but something stranger, something beyond classification, beyond mythology. Beings whose presence was not defined by form or element but by frequency, by resonance, by a capacity to shape existence without tools. Without hands, without even thought, as though they themselves were extensions of creation's first command. They were not fallen in any traditional sense, not in the way later priests and scribes would reframe them through frightened doctrine or metaphorical flames, for there was no rebellion in the conventional meaning, no war in heaven, no betrayal of thrones. There was only divergence, a choice, a curiosity, a departure from symmetry, and that choice echoed through the fabric of creation like a dissonant note in an otherwise perfect song, reshaping everything in its path, causing ripples that birthed not just species or civilizations, but entirely new dimensions of time, of memory, of law. The Watchers, as they would later be called in fragments of scripture too incomplete to be reliable, were not mere overseers of man but engineers of environments, sculptors of probability, beings that inhabited not merely space but the intervals between spaces, orchestrating sequences of life that mirrored the geometry of the stars, and it was their decision to interact with this world, to press their essence into the clay of what would become Earth's first dreamers, that unspooled the chain of consequences which now, in the slow crumble of modern reality, began to stir again like dust disturbed by breath long after the tomb had been sealed. They did not build temples in the way men later would, did not raise stone upon stone or pray in vertical hierarchies of hierarchy and fear. Instead, they carved their instructions into the magnetic fields of continents, wove their intentions into the spirals of mollusk shells and the growth rings of thousand-year trees, embedding blueprints in silence, in vibration, in the tilt of light that touched stone circles aligned with stars that no longer existed, and though those monuments still stood in forgotten valleys and drowned ridges, the meaning behind them had long since faded, misinterpreted by myth, obscured by empire, lost to fire and flood and pride. But Earth had not forgotten. Not in bodies, but in structure, in geometry, in the precise reordering of nature's code, in the rising frequency of the planet itself, a slow upward hum that altered thought, shifted blood chemistry, destabilized the artificial constraints of time, making the days feel longer, the nights too brief, and within those distortions, things began to slip through, not monsters, not visions, but memories that were not yours, flooding minds that had no context, causing tears to fall for wars never fought, songs never heard, and cities long gone yet somehow remembered with painful clarity. The Book of Enoch, misunderstood as apocalyptic poetry, had never been prophecy but mechanism, a record not of judgment but of sequence, a series of encrypted rituals written not in theology but in cosmological calibration, and scattered across the earth, in forgotten monasteries, submerged ruins, crystalline caverns carved by neither water nor tool. The remnants of these instructions still lingered, dormant but intact, and now, with the first seal loosened by some convergence of time, sound, and thought, they began to awaken, one after another, in synchronization. Not all at once. Not violently, but rhythmically. Like breath returning to a lung that had waited too long beneath the sea. The synchronization did not echo like a drum nor strike like lightning, but moved instead like a tide beneath perception, lifting the buried mechanisms of memory ever so gently toward the surface, as if the planet itself were exhaling after holding its breath for 10,000 years, releasing signals too old for speech, too pure for translation, and yet somehow understood instinctively by the oldest organisms. By moss that grew in spirals on Arctic rock, by trees whose roots traced the veins of mountains, by the stones themselves, which vibrated with such subtle tension that even silence began to sound different, heavier, resonant, filled with the echo of something vast pressing once again against the veil of now. In the high plateaus where lightning never struck, and in the narrow ridges where shadow fell unnaturally long even at midday, the first tones began to resonate, not as sound, but as influence, a kind of geometrical pressure that shaped dreams and dissolved barriers, making the divisions between past and present, real and remembered, mortal and other, thin and permeable, until those who lived near the thresholds began to experience things for which no calendar or language had prepared them. They began to remember. Not their own lives, but the architecture of a world that no longer existed, crystalline towers that rose without foundation, cities shaped not by stone or hand but by magnetic resonance, flowing in patterns dictated by the movement of stars rather than the whims of kings, and above them, always watching, always calculating, the silent presence of the watchers, those who had once walked openly among the early tribes, not as gods nor masters but as custodians, engineers of equilibrium, whose purpose had never been power but balance, though even balance, when tilted slightly by will, can become tyranny. It had been the act of interference, not creation, but elevation, that had altered the course of what Earth was meant to become, for when the Watchers mingled with early humans, not through flesh but through structure, embedding pieces of their knowledge into the design of bone and thought and speech, they gave rise not to children, but to sequences, bloodlines encoded with strange echoes of memory. A faint rhythm made some among the species more attuned, more aware, more susceptible to the deeper music of the planet, which the others could not hear. Those children built great structures, megaliths aligned not only to the solstice but to constellations that no longer remained in the sky, temples whose stones vibrated in sympathetic frequencies with the earth itself, cities whose walls hummed beneath the moonlight and responded to touch with changes in temperature, light, and tone. But as with all gifts misplaced, knowledge became arrogance, and the balance turned to hunger, and hunger into empire, and empire into ruin, until the children of the Watchers, grown deaf to the subtle rules of resonance, fell like stars pulled back to the ground, their bones now entombed beneath every sacred hill and sunken isle. And in the aftermath, as silence returned and memory fractured, the earth did not cry out, it sealed. One by one, the harmonic gates were closed, not with locks or chains, but with patterns, vast, slow-moving sequences of geology and gravity, mathematics etched into tectonic drift and orbital decay, designed not to imprison but to delay, to suspend the resonance long enough that when it inevitably returned, it would do so not with wrath but with recognition, with a gentle awakening that might, perhaps, offer a second chance at understanding. But chance is not purpose, and time is not memory, and so the patterns, though patient, began to stir once more, guided not by will but by inevitability, the return of harmonics that could not be forever delayed. Across the deserts of the old world, where wind carved messages into dunes that no tongue could speak, stones began to vibrate in unison, a frequency so low it registered only in the marrow of animals, who began to migrate in strange patterns, forming spirals in their flight paths, sleeping in mirrored arrangements, acting out instinctive rituals that had not been seen in over 30 cycles of the Great Alignment. And in the deepest caves, whose walls bore inscriptions from before the shaping of rivers, the dust began to lift, floating upward without wind, as if summoned by the reawakening of gravity's twin, the draw of memory, and within these hollows, impossible to enter by ordinary means, the shapes of the old geometry began to glow faintly, not with fire, not with electricity, but with the resonant echo of something preparing to rise. Even the oceans, vast and secretive, began to churn differently, not on the surface, where the winds still played their illusions, but beneath, in the pressure-layered zones where light could not reach, where creatures without eyes drifted in peace, the great cities of coral and forgotten bones began to shift, not collapse, but rearrange, forming configurations of structure known only to the deepest echelons of memory, configurations that once, long ago, had signaled the gathering of the Watchers. And though mankind, as ever, rushed blindly toward distraction, toward glass screens, data streams, artificial stars and false heavens, the earth moved beneath them, slow and ancient and sure, preparing not for judgment or cataclysm, but for the resonance that would bridge what was with what would be. The Book of Enoch was not written with warning. It was encoded with instruction. It did not threaten, it described. It mapped the return of a structure, not a being, a frequency architecture that would one day rise again, not from the soil, but through it, in the bones of the mountains, in the flow of forgotten rivers, in the wind patterns that once carried seeds of stone through the air like pollen, settling in geometrical grids across every continent now broken by map and war. It would not rise like an army. It would not speak in words. It would re-emerge in pattern. A pattern that could not be heard, only remembered. There were those places in the world where the geometry had never fully vanished, where even after millennia of erosion, conquest, fire, and forgetting, certain alignments remained so precise that the stars, in their quiet revolutions, still paused briefly over their apexes each solstice, as if recognizing the ancient pacts made long before ink touched parchment, long before the tongue of man dared translate the language of the sky. In these places, high plateaus, submerged ridges, fault-bisected forests, time behaved differently, not slower or faster, but thicker, like honey poured through a sieve, delaying consequence and memory just enough that perception began to bleed, allowing moments of clarity too crystalline to be dream, too fleeting to be named. Among these forgotten geometries stood the ruins, not ruins in the traditional sense of crumbled stone and overgrown masonry, but of structures deliberately deconstructed and laid into the earth in precise angles, like bones returned reverently to the soil. What remained was not architecture, but memory arranged into matter, lines and depressions and shadow patterns that held, even now, the resonance of their origin, a soft hum beneath the frequency of thought, recognizable not through sight but through stillness. And there, in those places, the awakening began, not with sound, not with sign, but with a shift in proximity, as though something had moved within the earth itself, not toward the surface, but toward attention. There were no maps to these locations, they existed only as consequences of the original frequencies, harmonics that had long since degraded in language but lingered still in song, in pattern, in the ancient oral recitations that had survived the burning of temples and the drowning of islands. Songs sung in spirals, danced beneath eclipses, etched onto tools and talismans now buried beneath markets and streets, but still, somehow, active, like circuits that had not yet been powered. And then the signs became less symbolic and more material. A river in the north whose flow reversed for 6 nights under a blood-red moon, its waters revealing carved symbols in the bedrock that pulsed faintly in the dark and vanished by dawn. A mountain range whose silhouette, under specific starlight, formed a sigil matching the oldest diagrams hidden in the margin of the book, a pattern so complex it could not have emerged by chance, a blueprint made not by hand, but by gravitational memory. Salt plains that cracked in symmetrical lattices overnight, each segment precisely matching the resonant structure of subharmonic scales found only in the frequencies of pre-Atlantean stone monuments, long submerged beneath the ice sheets. And always, always, the silence, not absence of sound, but a presence that existed beneath it, like a thought the world had almost remembered, a name almost spoken, a presence once exiled, now returning. Not all who felt it could understand it, and not all who understood it could endure it, for the resonance did not come as a voice or vision, but as a pull, a gravitational yearning toward the original alignment, toward the point at which all things had once been synchronized, the convergence point where knowledge, form, and frequency had first been unified. They began to walk. Not in groups, not with words, but alone, across deserts, through ice, beneath cities, following a signal they could not explain, driven not by purpose, but by geometry within blood, a lineage of resonance encoded not genetically but structurally, passed down not through birth, but through proximity to the pattern, a silent inheritance that now called them to return. And deep beneath the earth, in vaults carved before language, before nation, before sin, the sequence stirred, not like a machine reactivating, but like an organism remembering its name. The book had never been about prophecy. It had been about timing. It had not warned of what would come. It had mapped when it would awaken. And the seals, spoken of in metaphor and feared as curses, were not mystical, they were intervals, harmonic keys in a chord too vast to be played in a single age. Each age had its tone. Each civilization had been a note. And now, the final resonance was near, not the end, but the convergence, the reassembly of a structure once broken, now returning, not as punishment, but as completion. The watchers were not returning. They had never left. They had only gone quiet, buried in structure, folded into the stone and air, encoded in the crystalline memory of the planet, waiting not to be reawakened, but to be remembered correctly. And when that memory aligned, when enough patterns had synced across enough nodes, when enough sequences had been reactivated through song, movement, and blood, the earth itself would open not with violence, but with recognition, like a lock turning at last with the right key. And beneath that lock, the chamber. And within that chamber, not a god, not a demon, not a weapon, but a blueprint. The final design. The map of the first resonance. The true shape of the world before time, and the mechanism by which it might become again. And so the earth, which had for millennia hummed beneath the burden of incomplete remembrance, began to pulse in ways imperceptible to the distracted mind of modernity, not in explosions, not in disasters, but in convergences too subtle for the senses, in patterns unfolding across geography, weather, time, and thought, synchronizing not only the material but the symbolic, reawakening connections that had long since frayed into legend and dust. On the high plains of Anatolia, where ancient megaliths stood like frozen echoes of forgotten rituals, a thin line of blue flame arced across the stone at midnight, not flame in the elemental sense, but an ionization of air, as if the structure itself were exhaling a breath it had held since before the last ice age. The symbols etched into its surface, weathered by wind and ages, aligned not with the stars above but with structures buried halfway across the world, submerged beneath jungle and ash, forming a global chord in sacred geometry, a design only the earth could hold and only time could play. The watchers, those whose name had been misunderstood by scribes and twisted by tongues that had never heard their true resonance, were not beings of flesh nor spirit, but of design, entities whose purpose had been to bind the layers of reality together in sacred proportion. What had been recorded in fragmented myth as a rebellion, their fall, was not treason but a sacrifice, a self-imposed descent into dimensional frequency, embedding themselves within the lattice of matter, not to rule, but to preserve. For the earth had been a convergence point, not the center of creation, but its bridge, a place where the frequencies of above and below could be tuned into harmony, a living instrument whose vibrations could anchor the design of all that existed beyond time. And yet, harmony was fragile. When man began to echo the sacred tones in imitation without comprehension, building ziggurats and temples, scripting chants in forgotten dialects, they awakened partial truths, half-tones that vibrated unevenly, causing fractures in the resonance. These were the first heresies, not of belief, but of vibration. Structures built in error became sites of distortion. Words spoken out of sequence fractured the code. And so the watchers, once silent within the planetary grid, began to resonate unevenly, not in malice, but in imbalance, their embedded frequencies warping, their purpose misaligned. It was not rebellion. It was interference. The Earth's chorus had gone dissonant. And so the design was locked. The great convergence was delayed, sealed within the intervals of the Earth itself, beneath mountain and trench, ice and crystal, to be reopened only when the tones could again be played in the correct progression, a song not of sound, but of alignment, a harmonic ritual stretched over eons. That time was now returning. A tremor, unnoticed by seismographs, passed through the South Pacific, a rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat of stone, repeated every 72 hours exactly, reverberating through tectonic plates not as motion, but as sequence, awakening mineral deposits encoded with memory. In the Amazon, a long-buried formation of megaliths, mistaken for hills for centuries, was revealed by lightning storms that moved in geometric patterns, igniting trees in spirals so precise they resembled the sacred mathematical spirals once carved into Sumerian skyplates. And across the earth, people began to dream, not of visions, not of symbols, but of structures, patterns of sound and motion, shapes that defied physics yet felt deeply familiar, as though memory itself had been seeded with their impression at birth. These dreamers did not speak, for language was too crude. They moved. They hummed. They drew circles within circles and began to walk in patterns older than dance, unknowingly reactivating nodes in the great planetary circuit. It was not coincidence. It was sequence. The Book of Enoch, long dismissed, redacted, buried by religious and political hands alike, had never been forbidden for its claims of angels or prophecy. Its danger was structural. It contained within its veiled poetry a map of activation, a guide to the intervals required to awaken the embedded watchers, not as beings, but as frequencies locked in stone, voice, blood, and breath. The names of the watchers, Samayaza, Azazel, and others, were not proper names, but harmonic designations, each representing a complex vibrational formula tied to an axis of the earth. Their so-called descent had not been a fall from grace, but a deliberate embedding into the lattice of matter, their sin not one of defiance, but of improper alignment after mankind echoed their tones without full comprehension. And the Nephilim, the offspring of union, were not literal giants, but anomalies in harmonic resonance, echoes of misaligned interaction between human frequency and planetary structure. The Earth, unable to contain such distortion, responded with correction, burying the tones in flood and fire, fracturing the chords into myths, languages, and empires, scattering the pieces so widely that only time itself could bring them back into convergence. Now, time itself was folding inward. Calendars across multiple traditions, Hebrew, Mayan, Vedic, and even digital, began to sync unintentionally, converging on dates of no political or agricultural significance, but of vibrational meaning. Days when magnetic anomalies spiked subtly. Nights when the moon cast shadows against starlight as though light itself had forgotten its path. Places where silence deepened inexplicably, as if sound had been absorbed by an invisible geometry reawakening beneath the skin of the world. There were no warnings. Only resonance. And in the ancient basalt caverns beneath what is now Ethiopia, where the earliest encoded sequences of the book were first spoken aloud in tones no longer remembered by modern throats, a chamber cracked open not by hand, but by tone, its walls unfolding in slow, precise geometries, revealing a vast obelisk carved from a single crystal, humming with a frequency beyond audible range, pulsing in tandem with distant storms that had no cloud, no lightning, only rotation. Above this chamber, in the surface world, nothing appeared changed. But deep within the planetary memory, the song had resumed. And far across the globe, deep beneath the ruins of submerged cities in the Indian Ocean and off the coasts of what was once Atlantis, the others began to stir, obelisks, pillars, coils of gold etched with codes unreadable but not forgotten. The earth, it seemed, was not a singular being, but a choir, and its members had begun to tune themselves once more. Not toward war. Not toward peace. But toward completion. The days no longer passed in predictable rhythm. What once were patterns of dawn and dusk began to blur, as if the sky itself were no longer certain whether it should reveal or conceal the firmament's hidden order. The wind spoke with new urgency, not in violence but in an articulate hum, as if guiding the few who could still hear toward the scattered fragments of the old truth, a truth that did not live in libraries or in temples, but in the earth's pulse, in the trembling of certain stones when the stars aligned. Along the broken spine of forgotten mountain ranges, those whose peaks were sheared flat as if by celestial blades, and whose ridges had been etched with symbols no erosion could erase, faint vibrations began to rise, not loud enough to hear, but enough to alter the dreamscapes of all who slept nearby. In those dreams, faces emerged not of people, but of watchers, not as figures of terror or reverence, but as unblinking custodians of a pact the world had tried desperately to forget. The pact had not been between God and man, nor between angels and the fallen, it had been struck in the depths of time, before even memory had coalesced into story, when consciousness itself had barely taken shape. It was the agreement that if knowledge were ever buried, it must not die, and if time were ever fractured, the echo must still lead the worthy back to the origin. That origin was not a place, it was a design. And slowly, as mountains breathed and lakes stilled, that design began to reveal itself once more, not as blueprints or diagrams, but as sensation, a resonance felt in the bones, a rhythm in the chest, a pull toward the places that had waited longest. In the deep jungle, where vines choked ruins built before the first names were spoken, moss-covered obelisks began to hum with subharmonics that no animal approached, yet no creature feared, they only watched and waited, as though they, too, remembered what mankind had tried to erase. And in that memory, the watchers stirred. Not to walk the earth again, that had never been their way, but to awaken the final phase of their long-dormant intention. They did not seek vengeance, nor judgment. Their mission had always been transmission. They were scribes of an architecture far more ancient than stone or scripture, they encoded meaning not in language, but in alignment, in the positions of stars, in the spin of particles, in the dreams of the dying and the visions of the newborn. And now the transmission was near completion. In the vast deserts where sand once buried secrets, enormous geometric depressions revealed themselves, patterns too precise to be natural, too ancient to be recent, and visible only during the 13 nights when the moon vanished from the sky entirely. During those nights, the air in those hollows became heavy, not with heat or dust, but with the thick texture of memory, as if space itself became denser within the boundaries of the sigils carved into the earth's skin. There, those who stood long enough began to feel something deeper than thought, they began to remember things that had never happened, to see visions of landscapes that did not exist in any known time, to hear voices that spoke not in sound, but in certainty. They remembered the Great Descent, not as myth, but as sequence. The watchers had not fallen by accident or rebellion, they had been drawn, not from heaven to earth, but from outside into. They were the architects of the bridge between form and intention, matter and will. And when they shaped humanity, they did so not with pride, but with purpose. That purpose had been shattered, not by corruption, but by containment. Others, jealous of the design, had sealed it away, buried it beneath the noise of time, and rewritten the rhythms to mask the signal. But signals do not die, they wait. And as the Book of Enoch had foretold in words few could truly interpret, the watcher's knowledge would return when the stars once more echoed the positions they held during the first alignment, a moment not of astronomy, but of agreement, when all things had moved in a single will. That moment approached again. Across the sky, in the early hours before even the birds dared sing, strange stars began to appear, stars that were not stars, but fixed lights that shimmered in unfamiliar colors and remained motionless even as the heavens spun around them. These lights blinked not randomly, but in pulses, 3 short, 2 long, 1 short, repeated in endless sequence. And those who could hear them in their dreams began to awaken with the same symbols etched into their skin, not as wounds, but as birthmarks re-emerging. Some tried to interpret them. Others tried to suppress them. But those who followed them began to walk paths that had never been mapped, yet still led them to the same place, a forgotten caldera where the air smelled of ozone and the ground trembled beneath their feet in time with their own breath. And there, the sky opened, not with fire or light, but with invitation. And so the earth, long bound in silence, prepared to speak again. And beneath the trembling caldera, beyond the veils of molten stone and crusted ash, the last chamber of origin stirred, not with eruption, but with return. For within the earth's interior lay not chaos, but a chamber forged before the planet had cooled, constructed not of mineral, but of resonance, a perfectly tuned echo chamber where memory and matter wove together into the latticework of intent. It had waited beyond reach, guarded not by walls, but by forgetfulness, sealed not by doors, but by disbelief. But now belief itself cracked like old stone under the pressure of reawakening. The chamber's surface pulsed with colors that did not belong to the visible spectrum, hues that bypassed the eyes entirely, transmitting directly into the blood of the beholder, whispering messages into marrow, bypassing language, bypassing fear. This was not revelation. It was recollection. For here was the first alphabet, not of letters or sound, but of force and frequency, the original syntax by which the watchers had once written reality into shape, bending raw possibility into the form of birds and trees and flame and flesh. This alphabet had not been spoken in eons. Yet now it surged again, not through tongues, but through tectonics, shaking the ground in rhythms that matched no known quake, but traced perfectly the ancient pulse once mapped in the Enochian diagrams, spirals within spirals, endlessly fractal, impossibly precise. The waters responded first. In lakes long hidden beneath glaciers, great shapes began to form, not physical creatures, but silhouettes of intention, patterns within the sediment that moved as though obeying choreography set in motion before the stars had names. Flocks of birds altered their migration, flying routes older than civilization. The auroras above the polar skies sharpened into symmetrical forms, eyes, hands, circles within triangles, visible only for moments, yet branded onto the minds of those who saw them like sigils etched into obsidian. And in the deepest places of the forest, those few untouched by blade or flame, the trees began to lean toward one another, branches weaving together into arches, thresholds, as if preparing for return. Not of the watchers. Not of gods. But of memory made whole. The Book of Enoch had always hinted that the fall was not a punishment, it was a delay. A moment carved out of time to allow something larger to complete itself beyond the reach of sight. The knowledge passed down by the watchers had never been meant to dominate. It had been meant to prepare. But prepare for what? The answer did not come in words. It came in the sky. For as the final stars aligned, stars long banished by shifting orbits, now returned to position as if no time had passed, the firmament trembled, not as fabric, but as mirror. And in that mirror the earth did not reflect the sky reflected the earth, revealing that what humanity called above was merely a projection of what had long slept below. The vault was opening. It was not a gate, but a chorus, a harmony of frequency and symbol that spanned not just the world, but all worlds tethered to this one, sister planes and shadow layers, resonant harmonics of reality that now began to sing in concert. The Watchers had inscribed their message not on stone, but in vibration, encoded in places where the veil between seen and unseen thinned, volcanic caverns, polar ice caves, the hearts of meteor impact craters, and beneath desert monoliths whose shadows aligned only once every 100 centuries. And now those alignments had returned. The Book of Enoch, misunderstood and misquoted, had not foretold the end of days. It had mapped the resetting of them, a great resynchronization when the lost rhythm would return and reality itself would breathe in time again. Those attuned to it felt it before they understood. They felt it in the way birds paused mid-flight, in the sudden halting of machines, in the disappearance of static, in the impossible silence before thunderstorms, in dreams that lasted days though measured in seconds. They gathered, not by invitation, but by instinct. In canyons where no path led, by lakes that did not exist on maps, atop ridges that shimmered with false horizons, they arrived, not prophets, not chosen, but tuned, people whose lives had always hovered at the edge of the real, those dismissed as sensitives, madmen, visionaries. They found one another not with words, but with recognition. Each carried a piece of the signal, a sliver of the great frequency that once restored would awaken the vault's final function. Not destruction. Not salvation. But completion. And as they stood at the convergence, with the stars directly overhead whispering in pulses that vibrated through bone, through memory, through stone and sea, they remembered the design. It had always been about coherence. The Watchers were not messengers, they were instruments. Their fall was not a rebellion, it was a resonant descent, a lowering of frequency to anchor meaning within the material. And now, after uncounted ages of distortion and delay, the time had come for the chord to be struck again, for reality to be retuned. And so the vault sang. Not in music. Not in light. But in pure intention, vibrating outward through the lattice of being, shaking loose the falseness, the masks, the noise. Mountains shifted subtly. Oceans drew strange geometries along their shores. Time folded back on itself in moments so brief they left only déjà vu in their wake. The Watchers did not return. They never had to. Because their psalm was never about them. It was about what they had awakened. And now, it was awakening again. And as the sky mirrored the earth and the vault released its resonance, there came a shiver that moved not just across the crust of the world, but deep into its mantle, awakening the sleeping seams of the planet, not with destruction, but with the groaning breath of long-bound memory exhaling its first sigh in eons. It was not an earthquake, nor a natural tremor, but something older, slower, deeper, a harmonic ripple that bent time and stone, pressing ancient geometry into the very grain of reality, and across the globe, those whose bones still held the memory of the first pattern felt it vibrate through them like a forgotten name whispered just once, but in perfect pitch. From the high volcanic ridges of the Afar Triangle where tectonic plates kissed and pulled apart in slow agony, to the magnetic veins buried beneath the Siberian permafrost, to the seafloor rift valleys where light never touched but where ancestral voices still flowed like thermal rivers through the black, the world itself began to hum in chord. This was no planetary accident, no coincidence of geology, but the beginning of the great retuning, a planetary realignment not of continents, but of meaning. The Watchers had not died, nor vanished, nor been punished by some divine decree. They had dissolved. They had woven themselves into the foundations of the world, translated not into myth but into matter, encoding themselves into salt and root and mineral, their thoughts becoming echoes in coral, their voices transcribed into the spin of electrons in quartz, their memories fused into crystalline alignments found only in the deepest chambers of the earth. And now, as the vault above responded to the vault below, the lattice of these memories reformed not as ghosts, but as patterns, whispering not in words, but in consequence. Everywhere the veil was thinnest, symbols appeared. They were not drawn nor carved, but grown, as though reality itself had finally begun to show its inner language. Moss formed glyphs in the hollow of ancient trees. Lava cooled into perfect concentric spirals. Cloud formations curled into mirrored sigils that pulsed before vanishing. None lasted more than a moment. But for those attuned, they left behind impressions stronger than any vision, instructions, maps, codes embedded in dream and instinct. And among these symbols was one that recurred across all geographies, a triangle formed of 3 interlocked circles, each rotating in opposite direction, each etched with marks no known language could claim, yet which stirred something older than language in all who saw them. This was the key, not to unlock something, but to tune oneself, to resonate in harmony with the pulse now rising from the earth's heart. Those who saw the symbol in waking life began to dream of impossible staircases descending into geometries that did not conform to gravity. They heard water running upward, bells that rang without source, and light that behaved as though it remembered something the world had forgotten. Some wept without knowing why. Others walked into the wilderness and never returned, pulled not by madness but by magnetic instinct, the ancient call of alignment. The Enochian tradition, long buried beneath centuries of distortion and superstition, had always been a map, not to the heavens, but to the structure of consciousness itself, a guide not for salvation, but for synchronization with the source that flowed beneath and behind all form. The Book of Enoch, misread as prophecy, was in truth an instrument manual, a way to hear the original chord and to retune the soul to its frequency. But this knowledge had been scattered, fragmented through time, fractured through fear, and now, only in pieces, could it return. And yet those pieces were gathering. In the salt flats of the Atacama Desert, reflections began to move without cause, showing not the sky above but another sky, inverted, layered with constellations no telescope had recorded. In the deepest trenches of the Pacific, lightless and silent, bioluminescent creatures formed patterns never before seen, arranging themselves into great spiral mandalas that pulsed and shimmered in sync with unknown tides. In the caves of Lascaux and Chauvet, once thought to hold only primitive art, new symbols emerged beneath the old, not painted, but formed as the pigment bled through from deeper layers of stone, revealing lines that matched precisely the symbols in the lost Enochian scrolls, the same as those now forming in moss and ash and shadow. No one understood. But everything remembered. Because this was not awakening. It was reconnection, the returning signal of a system long dormant, long denied, now flaring to life in anticipation of an event beyond understanding but not beyond instinct. The Watchers had not warned of apocalypse. They had seeded continuity, embedding beacons into the very flow of life so that when the veil thinned and the vault sang, the tuned would rise and recall the path. And the path was not straight. It spiraled. It curved through time, folded through memory, flowed through bloodlines and water veins and myths so ancient they had no names. It passed through symbols mistaken for religious texts, through architecture built by forgotten hands, through resonance chambers whose echoes had never faded. It wove through the world like a great serpent made not of scales, but of meaning. And those who followed it did not walk. They remembered. And remembering was enough. For the earth itself had begun to open, not with cracks or rupture, but with invitation. Ancient chambers, once thought lost to lava or ocean or glacier, began to reveal themselves, caves that breathed without wind, temples whose ceilings aligned once more with the star patterns of prehistory, obsidian corridors whose walls shimmered with soft internal light, revealing glyphs that moved and reformed as if alive. These were not monuments. They were reactivated memory cores, places where the original architecture of consciousness had once been housed, maintained by the Watchers and now humming again with forgotten charge. The Book of Enoch had described these not as locations, but as thresholds, points of interference where dimensions touched, where the song of matter and the silence of potential coiled around one another like twin strands, forming gateways not through space, but through recognition. To enter was not to travel, but to shift state. And those who found these places did not return. Because return was no longer the point. The earth, once thought inert and passive, now responded like an organism remembering its own birth song. Ocean currents shifted subtly. Winds flowed in ancient gyres. Magnetic fields pulsed in rhythmic sequence. It was as if the planet itself was not preparing for something to arrive, but was preparing itself to become something else entirely. A vessel. A mirror. A host. And then the light began. Not from the sky. From below. In places where no infrastructure existed, light rose from the earth like breath, soft, phosphorescent tendrils unfurling from stone, from water, from roots, each pulse echoing the triangle of 3 interlocked circles, each glow harmonizing with the great frequency rising from the core. These were not lights to see by. They were lights that saw, pulsing searchlights of memory sweeping across the surface of the world, seeking resonance, seeking those who still carried the fragmentary cord of the Watcher's legacy within them. And they found them. Those tuned to the pattern found themselves drawn, without knowing how or why, to convergence points mapped only in intuition, abandoned megaliths, submerged structures, forest clearings aligned to forgotten moons. Here, they gathered not to worship or speak, but to listen, not with ears, but with structure, aligning their breath, their blood, their thought to the rising hum of the world's original song. The vault was not closing. It was unfolding. And from its heart emerged not fire, nor beings, nor judgment, but a frequency so pure, so ancient, that even reality itself bent slightly under its passage, warping time, softening boundaries, untethering cause from effect. Those who heard it wept, not from fear or awe, but from remembrance, the knowledge that all things had once been whole, and were becoming so again. The Watchers had not brought knowledge. They had brought tuning forks. And now, struck once more by the hand of memory, they vibrated into being again, not as figures, but as forces, restoring the hidden architecture of coherence beneath the chaos of form. And the world, humming in its bones, began to rise. And far beneath the surface of that trembling world, where stone no longer obeyed the logic of geology and time flowed like breath through an unseen lung, the last vaults began to open. They did not creak, nor roar, nor burst with spectacle, but unfolded like thought, slowly, deliberately, as if reality itself required adjustment to allow their presence again. These were not chambers in the sense of space, but loci of alignment, places where memory returned not as dream or symbol, but as structure. Here, walls moved with intention, corridors extended as the mind extended, and light was not cast from above but radiated outward from presence itself. Each step taken within these ancient geometries echoed not in air but in identity, as if the very notion of self had to pass through long-forgotten filters in order to proceed. Symbols older than alphabets, older than sound, shimmered along archways that seemed to pulse with the awareness of those who passed beneath them, not watching, but synchronizing. The structures were not ruins. They had not decayed. They had simply withdrawn. And now, as the ancient harmonic reawakened, they returned, not built, but reintegrated into the fabric of this world. Cities once invisible to human perception now glimmered behind the edges of vision. They did not appear like holograms or ghosts, but as consequences, as inevitable as the rising tide, emerging with the clarity of something that had always been there, waiting only for the right note to be struck. Above ground, the sky had changed. It no longer scattered sunlight in randomness, but filtered it through a lens of memory. The constellations, once mapped by wandering shepherds and seafarers, began to shift into alignments not seen since before the moon's capture. Some swore the moon itself no longer moved as it had, that it had taken on a second rhythm, a hidden cycle now pulsing beneath the known phases, syncing with something beneath the earth rather than around it. Animals responded first. Herds no longer migrated by instinct alone, but by resonance, moving along paths that glowed faintly in their bones, rivers of memory written into the marrow of their kind. Certain birds flew in patterns that drew vast sigils across the sky, visible only when viewed from the hidden mountaintops where the vaults had once echoed the Watcher's breath. Bees clustered in shapes resembling glyphs long erased from every known script. Even the wind shifted, curling in spirals that matched the geometric vortexes etched onto the underside of forgotten megaliths. And then the water itself changed. It no longer obeyed gravity with the same obedience. In certain caverns and gorges, streams flowed upward for hours at a time, tracing paths that seemed absurd but were, when mapped against the diagrams hidden in Enoch's suppressed verses, perfectly logical. Oceans began to pulse in cycles deeper than tides, as if responding to a call that vibrated not from the moon, but from the ancient harmonic heart of the earth, a core not of molten metal alone, but of ancient design. This was not natural disaster. It was natural remembrance. And as the remembrance deepened, so too did the transformation of those who had been touched by the pulse. They were not prophets. They did not speak revelations. But they began to remember things that could not be remembered, languages never learned now flowed through their dreams, faces long forgotten surfaced not as hallucinations, but as returning parts of a pattern. Their veins carried not just blood, but sequence, strands of intent written into the double helix not by chance, but by the watchers themselves, left dormant until the world was ready. Some tried to hide it. Others could not. Languages never learned now flowed through their dreams, faces long forgotten surfaced not as hallucinations, but as returning parts of a pattern. Their veins carried not just blood, but sequence, strands of intent written into the double helix not by chance, but by the watchers themselves, left dormant until the world was ready. Some tried to hide it. Others could not. Their presence triggered phenomena, clocks pausing, fires ceasing to consume, mirrors reflecting scenes not behind but ahead. Trees leaned toward them. Stones vibrated beneath their feet. And wherever they went, animals stared, unblinking, not with fear but with recognition. They were not gods. They were keys. Each carried a piece of the frequency. And each, drawn together not by destiny but design, found themselves in places they could not have reached by choice. The vaults welcomed them not with grandeur, but with familiarity, as if the stones themselves sighed at their arrival, remembering the touch of their ancestors' hands, the rhythm of their breath, the pulse of their steps. Inside, they did not find relics or relic hunters. They found alignment. Great orbs of unknown material spun soundlessly above pedestals made of stone that shifted temperature with thought. Walls displayed maps that changed depending on who stood before them, not maps of terrain, but of possibility. The Book of Enoch had described the movements of the Watchers, their descent, their teachings, but these vaults contained what had never been written, the purpose. Not to teach mankind secrets of heaven, but to prepare earth to become one. The Watchers had not rebelled. They had anchored. Their so-called punishment was not exile, it was integration. Each one had merged with a facet of the earth, flame, stone, storm, seed, wave, wind, embedding themselves not in body, but in pattern. They had become part of the memory of the planet itself. And now, as the harmonic unfolded again, their presence stirred. Not as beings. As functions. Across the globe, ancient locations once dismissed as myth began to shimmer. Not visibly, not to all, but to those attuned, they appeared, beneath the sands of Yubar, under the shadows of Uluru, within the flooded terraces of Yanaguni. These were not ruins. These were waiting vessels. And now the time had come for them to open. Not to release, but to merge. The veil between body and planet thinned. Some wept without knowing why. Others stood silently, sensing that the wind was no longer merely weather, that the rain no longer merely fell, that even the stars no longer merely shone. They watched, they awaited. And then the pulse reached its zenith. The harmonic, once faint, became undeniable. Every mountain, every tree, every bone hummed with it. It was not loud. It was true. And within that truth, time folded. Not backward. Not forward. But inward. And within the fold, something opened, not a portal, not a light, but a realization. That the Book of Enoch had never been about prophecy, never about punishment, never about the fall or the Watchers or the angels, but about completion. It was the earth's own story. It had waited for its voice to return. And now, it had begun to speak again. And so the earth, long thought to be silent, stirred with breath older than mountains, older than oceans, older than the stars themselves. It was not a breath in the sense of wind, nor a motion that could be measured by seismograph or sight. It was the slow exhale of memory itself, drawn from the deep well of the planet's encoded consciousness, released at last through the reawakening of that which had been buried not beneath soil, but beneath perception. The ancient harmonic had not merely returned, it had begun to shape everything. In hidden valleys where no path had led for millennia, light shimmered in new frequencies, bending in arcs that had once formed the basis of forgotten alphabets. Trees turned subtly toward a central point, not sunward but memory-ward, following the silent pull of a force that moved not through gravity or magnetism, but through the resonance of long-stilled intention. And there, in a place with no name, not because it was unworthy, but because it was beyond naming, the final structure revealed itself. It did not rise from the ground. The earth withdrew from around it. Stone fell away like petals, and the last of the sealed vaults, the one which had never been carved but had always existed outside of time, breathed its shape into the world once more. It was not a temple, nor a tomb, nor a tower, it was the memory of design, the archetype of architecture that all sacred sites had tried to imitate, echo, or rediscover. Its proportions defied measurement. Its walls were not made of stone or metal, but of something that sang softly even in silence, a substance not yet discovered, because it had always remained just one octave beyond human awareness. Those who had been drawn, the keys in human form, those who carried the dormant sequences written by the watchers into their ancient bloodlines, felt it first not with their eyes, but in their bones. Their hearts did not beat, but chimed. And when they stepped within the unsealed geometry, they did not enter, they became. Boundaries dissolved. Time unraveled like thread from a spindle. And the truth was no longer hidden. The watchers had not fallen. They had descended as bridges. In hidden valleys where no path had led for millennia, light shimmered in new frequencies, bending in arcs that had once formed the basis of forgotten alphabets. Trees turned subtly toward a central point, not sunward but memory-ward, following the silent pull of a force that moved not through gravity or magnetism, but through the resonance of long-stilled intention. And there, in a place with no name, not because it was unworthy, but because it was beyond naming, the final structure revealed itself. It did not rise from the ground. The earth withdrew from around it. Stone fell away like petals, and the last of the sealed vaults, the one which had never been carved but had always existed outside of time, breathed its shape into the world once more. It was not a temple, nor a tomb, nor a tower, it was the memory of design, the archetype of architecture that all sacred sites had tried to imitate, echo, or rediscover. Its proportions defied measurement. Its walls were not made of stone or metal, but of something that sang softly even in silence, a substance not yet discovered, because it had always remained just one octave beyond human awareness. Those who had been drawn, the keys in human form, those who carried the dormant sequences written by the watchers into their ancient bloodlines, felt it first not with their eyes, but in their bones. Their hearts did not beat, but chimed. And when they stepped within the unsealed geometry, they did not enter, they became. Boundaries dissolved. Time unraveled like thread from a spindle. And the truth was no longer hidden. The watchers had not fallen. They had descended as bridges. The earth, long before the birth of humankind, had been a vessel, a womb for memory, a living library encoded not in text but in the recursive rhythms of ecosystems, molecules, storms, and dreams. When the watchers came, they did not break laws. They synchronized. They sewed meaning into matter. They did not bring knowledge. They revealed its structure within the world. And then, as designed, they vanished from view. Not exiled, not punished, not chained in caverns. But merged. Each one became an axis, a node of influence hidden within the elemental functions of the earth. One with fire, one with water, one with air, one with seed, one with flesh, one with thought. Their names, long misunderstood as titles of rebellion, were simply coordinates, vibrations within a larger equation, designed not to control, but to awaken when the cycle returned. And now, it had returned. Because humanity, for all its war and wonder, all its confusion and clarity, had at last reached the point where its imagination had caught up to its inheritance. The minds of children dreamed dreams once only visible to prophets. The geometry of sleep began to echo the sacred spirals carved into petrified temples long forgotten. And the watchers stirred, not as forms, but as functions, ready to complete the process. It was never about salvation. It was about symphony. The earth, the watchers, and the ancient memory of design were instruments. Humanity was the final note. And then, as the last of the attuned passed through the corridor that had no floor and no walls, only a path of understanding, the sky changed. Not in color, but in recognition. The stars did not shift, they responded. They flickered in patterns no telescope could chart, aligning into constellations that were not maps of animals or gods, but sentences. Above the unsealed vault, the heavens themselves began to speak, not with thunder or fire, but with structure. Lights formed equations, rhythms, songs. The entire cosmos bent ever so slightly toward Earth, as though waiting for the long-silent sibling to finally answer its name. And within the vault, deep in its heart where no light reached but where everything shone, the true book lay open. It was not a book of paper. It had no ink. It had no spine. It was a living memory, shaped like a sphere, rotating not in space but in possibility. It contained no stories, yet every story that had ever been told bent toward it, as if seeking to return home. Those who stood before it did not read it with eyes. They remembered it through their entire being. The moment they stood in its presence, they became part of its unfolding. And then, the final realization bloomed, quiet, unstoppable, total. The Book of Enoch had never been written for those in power, nor for priests, nor for scholars. It had been hidden in the hearts of those who could remember. It was not meant to be understood. It was meant to be lived, reawakened when the earth and its children could finally hold it without distortion. And so the vault closed, not as a seal, but as a completion. The earth, now aware of itself once more, breathed deeper. The oceans changed color ever so slightly, as elements realigned. The wind moved in a new rhythm. And the stars, once fixed, now danced with slight variance, as if freed from their long-held positions. The entire structure of reality had subtly shifted, not broken, not rewritten, but corrected. And humanity, in fragments and dreams, began to remember. Children drew maps of places no one had ever seen, but which matched the patterns buried beneath mountains. Artists painted with colors not on any known spectrum. Musicians composed songs that caused animals to fall silent and listen. Languages began to mutate, not into chaos, but into cadence, syllables folding into forgotten harmonics. And somewhere, in the deepest part of the earth's design, the watchers sang, not in chorus, but in completion. They had not fallen. They had become the earth. And now, the earth was waking. Let's wrap it up for today. Stay curious and be hungry for knowledge. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, take care.